The topic that I would like to raise to talk about during that session is the linkage between executive compensation and sustainability performance targets at the corporate level, of course. I'm pretty sure you'll agree that it is not exactly new, and perhaps that won't fit into the requirement for new forms of governance, but at least, and you tell me if it's not appropriate, but it is something that has been growing quite significantly over the past 2-3 years. And it is a governance model for corporations that is gaining a lot of attention and growing very quickly. And the fact that they are holding their executives accountable for sustainability-related performance targets serve, to some extent, the dual purpose of meeting stakeholder performance targets, building shareholder value, but also some of those practices are good for the planet. For instance, many companies in the high-impact industries, such as the materials industry, the energy industry, they are holding their executives accountable for a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, for instance. So that is also good for the planet, in addition to being good for their own corporate value, shareholder value. So this is basically what I had in mind in terms of focusing my part of the presentation and what I'm going to bring to that session.
Are there any new emerging trends? You talk about this in terms of its resurgence over the last 2 or 3 years. Are there any new aspects of this in terms of governance and executive pay that we need to take a closer look at in terms of how it's being done differently?
Yeah, I guess some of the some of the developments on that front are two things. One is the choice of those targets. Previously, a lot of those companies had some very generic, broadly defined performance targets, such as being sustainable, doing well for society. Now we're seeing more and more companies having some very narrowly defined performance targets. The other thing that I also wanted to bring, perhaps as a novelty, is the fact that while previously most of the companies that were engaged in that practice were companies involved in the high-impact sectors of mining, energy, well, we are seeing more and more companies from the financial services industry, for instance, industries which we think have a limited impact on the environment, on the planet, but still they are engaging in those practices. And what I was thinking of doing is to come up with examples from 5 companies, from the banking industry, from the healthcare industry, from the real estate industry, examples of what those companies are doing in terms of rewarding their executives for the achievement of sustainability performance targets. I guess the other novelty as well is the fact that at least one country has legislated to require their banks to reward their executives to achieve sustainability-related performance targets. This is new, and I think that's the only one. It's a case of the Netherlands. They have a Dutch governance code, and it's mentioned in there that banks are required to have their executives held accountable for that.
There is a perfect world that you can envision in terms of new governance forms or structures for us to look at and to hopefully become a reality at some point in time. Do you have some ideas in terms of how you'd like to see governance in the future and how it could be either measured and or managed?
Yeah, it would be a perfect alignment of corporate governance from the very top of the organization, and by top I mean the board of directors, have them take a view that the company is not only exist to achieve shareholder value, but also to achieve stakeholder value. So once the board takes that realization and then implements it down the organization, so the board will set the performance targets that they fit that broader stakeholder view, and then those performance targets are going to drill down to the executives, the CEO, and the whole C-suite, for whom they're going to set those targets. Currently, it's not the case. There are only a few cases where the board is taking that active stakeholder view. And moreover, there are only a few board committees that actually set sustainability performance targets for the executives. The role of the board so far, unfortunately, is in most cases restricted to just monitoring the company's compliance to environmental, human rights regulation, environmental laws. So there's not really that integration of corporate stakeholder performance, corporate strategy down to executive compensation. Although there are a couple of cases that I'd like to present.
If there are other enablers that you'd like to see in place that would help make this type of governance more resilient and actually take hold. What kind of enablers do you think are also necessary in the world to help this type of governance model become more of a reality?
I guess something that has been pretty successful so far, and I think that could be replicated in our case, is greater involvement from investors. Because investors are the ones who hold the power to change the way how companies behave and how their executives are rewarded. Let me take the example of greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, for instance. Over the past few months, there has been a lot of investor initiatives that have called for companies to be more responsible towards climate change. They have altered their portfolio holdings in line with investing more into companies that are doing better for climate change, reducing their portfolio holdings of companies that are not doing so well. And many companies have responded positively to those increasing investment calls. So seeing more of those investor initiatives, for instance, many investors have signed a letter demanding that stock exchanges mandate listed companies to do better, to disclose on climate change, for instance. And those initiatives have been successful so far, and there are many, many to come. I was thinking of something that we could have something like that to mandate executive compensation that's in line with sustainability performance targets, pretty much in the same way as what the Netherlands has done for its banks. The other thing also that will be important to have is legislation that is clearly defined. Over the past few years, legislation that has called for companies to disclose on greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, hasn't been met with a lot of success, and that's because in most cases, those pieces of legislation have been very badly written. They are broad, they are nebulous at best. We have seen cases where, for instance, in the case of the UK, a clearly defined, narrowly focused piece of legislation telling companies exactly what they have to do are ingredients for most successful pieces of legislation. So if you were to replicate the Dutch model globally, or to have this kind of practice to be disseminated through a private route, similar to what the GRI has done with sustainability reporting, clearly defined rules is important.
Thank you. That, I think, is exactly what we're looking for. This is just to kind of get the conversation started between all of us and kind of get our thoughts going. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, Michael.